It is Halloween. It is Halloween. Time to make a spooky scene. Where are my blunderheads? I'm just kidding. Alright, since it's October, I think it's time to make a spooky scene. Before we get started, make sure to like and subscribe down below and hit that bell so you don't miss out on any future tutorials or any Blender to Reality episodes that we come out with. Costs you nothing and it helps me immensely and helps this channel just keep growing. I am so thankful for every one of my subscribers right now, and I can't tell you enough how exciting it is to keep making more Blender tutorials, more 3D prints, and keep teaching you all new art stuff and how we can all bring more creativity into the world. Without further ado, let's jump into this tutorial and let's get it. Wow! Welcome back to Blender, everybody. Today we are going to be making a spooky scene. And I gathered up some reference images here with dark forest and fog, and then I think I'm going to be adding a few little monsters in there just to add some character figuratively and literally. So once you have your reference images ready and collected, we can jump right into creating the scene. And this scene is going to be broken up into three main pieces. So it'll be foreground, midground, and the sky. We're going to start with the foreground piece. So once you open up Blender, hit A to select all and delete. Let's add in a plane. Scale it up 200 or dimension of 400 by 400 meters. In edit mode, subdivide with 100 cuts and then apply a level 2 subdivide modifier. Next, add in a displace modifier and click new texture, then go to the texture tab. We'll be using the cloud texture today, and adjust the size to 2, the depth to 6, and the nabla, I think that's how you say it, nabla, to 0.05. Back in the modifier, adjust the strength to a 0.45 and the mid-level to a 0.352. What I like to do with environment design is add in a camera right away so I can start building off of the shot that I want. So let's add in a camera, place it at an angle in an area on your environment that you really like how the shot's looking, or a good starting point for where we can build off the shot. Adjust the resolution, adjust the output resolution to 2560 by 1080 and 30 FPS. Once the camera is added, let's prep the weight maps for our particle systems on this foreground piece. I created a trees, rocks, and grass weight maps, but I only ended up using the trees and the grass weight maps. So you could skip the rocks if you want, but it does add another level to your environment to make it more realistic. Make your weight painting to what you would like and what matches your references, or just how you feel like. Make your weight paint to what you would like for the scene, and I'm using my references here with a stone walk path, so I need to make sure that I keep my weights out of the area where the brick walk path will be. And then from here you can also adjust your mesh with proportional editing in edit mode. Once we have all that done, make sure to apply scale, and then in edit mode select all faces and unwrap. And now we can mix a shader for the foreground piece. What I did is I found shaders on BlenderKit or Ambient CG. On Ambient CG I use the Ground 78, Ground 72, and Bricks 75B. With the foreground selected, add a new shader. Click the Principled BSDF and hit Ctrl-Shift-T to add in a texture. Add the color, ambient occlusion, displacement. I use the normal GL, and then add the roughness too. Oh, also make sure to shade smooth your mesh. Group this shader with Ctrl-J and label it Ground 1. Duplicate the Principled BSDF and then use Alt-P to remove it from the group. And then now again repeat using Ctrl-Shift-T to add in our next ground texture. So I added in ground 72 for the second one and use the same normal map too when you add in your texture. So I'm using the normal GL again. Group this shader and label it ground 2. And then with Control Shift right click, you could drag over both principal BSDFs to mix the shaders. Adjust the ground 1 scale to 10.6, and then I adjusted the ground 2 scale to 9.2. Now let's add a noise texture to the factor of this mix shader. Add a color ramp and click the noise texture and then hit Control T to map the noise texture to our mesh. Increase the contrast on the color ramp and then adjust the noise texture scale to 6.8, detail 15, and then on the mapping scale adjust it to 0.7. Now we can add our stone walk path. Duplicate the principal BSDF again, Alt-P to separate it from the group, and then now let's do Control-Shift-T and bring in our brick 75B texture. Once you do that, create a weight map for the walking path, and then go into Vertex Paint and select the Paint drop-down menu and click Vertex Color from Weight. Now mix the brick texture with our mix shader that is mixing our two ground textures. You can do so again by using Control Shift right click and drag over the principal BSDF for the bricks and then over the mix shader for the two ground textures. I adjusted the scale of the bricks to 12.6. I rotated it 30.8 degrees on the Z. And then now on the factor for the new mix shader between the bricks and the ground, we can add in an attribute node and invert the color and add a color ramp. And you can adjust the contrast in the color ramp to how you would like it and what you're wanting your scene to end up looking like. And now we should have a mix of our brick and our ground textures, and the brick should only be in the area where we painted during the weight map. Now it's time to create some trees using the Sapling Tree Generator add-on, which is free with Blender. You just need to go into Preferences. Either search for the add-on Sapling Tree Generator, or you'll have to download it and bring it into Blender. And when you activate this add-on, it will be in our Curves menu. So Shift A to add new, go to Curves, and at the bottom should be Sapling Tree. And when you open it up, use that menu that pops up with it. And there's tons of settings, tons of presets, and a lot of things that you could play around with to learn this add-on a little more. But I'm going to jump right into it. So in the Geometry tab, click on the preset, and I used Weeping Willow. I changed the resolution of the geometry to 4:6. And then go to Branch Growth and play around with the settings there. I adjusted the curvature a little bit so the branches would bend down a little more. And then I added a armature to our tree, gave it a wind strength of 0.15. And now with the tree selected, I went into Blender Kit to find some bark shaders, or you can go on Ambient CG to find some too. So I found this bark shader on Blender Kit and I just adjusted the scale to 3. Then I wanted to add a few different variations of a tree, so I created a few more. But I changed the geometry and the branch growth for each one to make them all a little different and make the scene a little more realistic. Now with a few trees created, we can add in a tree particle system. So go to our Particle Systems tab and add a new one. Label the system and the settings to tree.001. Make it a hair system. Click Advanced and Rotation. And then in the particle system, scroll down to vertex groups, and then in density, let's add in our tree weight map. In the render settings of our particle system, set it as render as collection and choose our tree collection. I adjusted the number of this particle system to 50 and make the orientation axis object Y. I set the scale of our trees to 1.78, and then I added a little bit of rotation phase and randomness. So for the rotation phase, I set it to 0.21. Randomize, I put 0.048. In instance collection, check off the boxes pick random, object rotation, and object scale. And now we have a tree particle system. Now with that done, we can move on to our midground piece. Shift A to add in a new plane. Scale it up bigger than our foreground piece and place it behind. Then again, use the displace modifier after subdividing 100 cuts and applying a subdivision modifier of level 2. And then make sure to apply scale and then go back into edit mode, select all faces, and unwrap. I again used the cloud texture, but this time I adjusted the size to 0.28, depth of 4, and a nabla of 0.03. And then for our midground piece, I needed to go into edit mode to use proportional editing so we can hide some of the edges of these land pieces. And then again for this piece of land, let's add in a weight map for the trees. But instead of adding a whole weight map over the entire mesh, we can just use the portion that's directly behind the foreground. That way we save render power and aren't rendering out a bunch of trees that aren't even going to be seen. So now go back into the Particle Systems tab for our midground. Let's add a new one. Apply the tree setting particle system that we created earlier, but let's duplicate that so we can adjust the scale and number of trees in this particle system. So duplicate it and then rename it trees.002. I adjusted the number for this particle system to 150, and I made the scale of our trees 0.754. And then for this midground piece, I used the same shader that we mixed for the foreground, but I just duplicated it, adjusted the scale on each ground texture, and then I removed the walking path shader because we don't have the vertex group for this one. I think our scene's really coming together now, and I'm loving how it's looking. So since we have both our foreground and midground pieces relatively done, we can explore BlenderKit and other free or paid-for add-ons to find other trees, rocks, stumps, or log models just to add in more realism and more layers to our environment. While I was exploring BlenderKit, I did find some rock models, and one of them even had tree roots coming out of it, so I thought that was perfect for our dark, spooky forest today. So once you scour all add-ons and free model websites, place all your forest decorations wherever you want and where you think it's going to be visually engaging for you. With all that added, it's time to add some grass and other layers to our environment here. And I'm only going to add a grass particle system to our foreground piece because if we put it in the midground, we really won't see it because it's going to be a dark nighttime scene. So download any grass models that you like. I'm using Botaniq for my grass. On Botaniq, they have tons of different vegetation, trees, grass, rocks. You can also search through them by categorizing them through seasons. So I found some dry grass, like 3 different models of dry grass. I downloaded all of them, put them off to the side in our scene, and then I created a new particle system and labeled the particle system and the settings grass.001. Again, make it a hair system, advanced, check off rotation, and then go into the render as, and again make it a collection and choose our grass collection. Scroll back down to the vertex groups and let's add our grass weight map to the density. I made the scale of our grass 3.88 and then the scale randomize is a 0.257. Rotation is object Y and I made the number of grass models 1500. And as you can see, just adding grass and more layers of environment really brings your scene together and makes it feel more realistic, and I think we're really starting to get a spooky scene going. Now with our environment pieces pretty much done, guess what time it is? It's monster time! For our spooky scene, I wanted to add a few little monsters just to add some character, literally and figuratively. And I just kept them simple, and especially since it's going to be nighttime, I thought it'd be really cool to have glowing eyes, so that way it brings in different light sources into our scene. So I made a few different characters. I used UV spheres, cylinders, and cubes just to keep basic monster shapes and give them horns, make them all different types of monsters. And then for applying textures and shaders to them, I just kept it very basic. So I just added different colors to them and then kept the roughness about the same. Didn't do anything crazy with it. And then in the emissions tab for the I principal BSDF, let's adjust the strength to 3. And you can create your monsters to look like anything you want. There's no rules of what it's supposed to look like, what it needs to look like. It's whatever you find visually engaging. So here is a sped up version of me creating the rest of the monsters. Now with our monsters made, we can add fog to our scene using a principal volume shader on a giant cube. So what we need to do is Shift A, add a cube, and scale it over the environment and adjust it to where it's covering most of our foreground. Go to the Object tab on the right and change the display as to bounds. That way a giant cube's not blocking our light or blocking our view of the scene. Make a new shader for this giant cube and delete the principal BSDF that's plugged in originally and add in a principal volume. And then plug that into your volume port for the output. Add a noise texture and a color ramp to the density of the volume shader. And make the noise texture 4D because we're going to animate it a little bit so the fog moves throughout our scene. I adjusted the scale to 3.47. Detail 15, roughness 0.7. Oh, and then bump up the contrast on that color ramp too so you can see the noise texture and you can adjust the clouds as accordingly and how you want it to be. Now for the last part of our scene and to bring it all home, we just need to add in a night sky image. I just Googled night sky images and then I adjusted it to be large images and made sure to grab a high quality one. And then once you have your night sky chosen from Google or wherever you got it from, go to Shift A and then add image as a reference. Scale it up huge and place it behind everything in our scene. And then in the shader editor, plug the color into the strength. I think this scene is just coming together piece by piece and it's looking better each time. And now that we have each major piece of an environment, we can light up the scene and add in some light sources. I'm going to speed this up because you can add in lighting that you like or however you want to set up your lighting. But I'll go over what I added into my scene. I used 3 area lights, 3 over the foreground piece, and then 3 over the background tree line. The strength of these lights range from 10,000 to 50,000 watts. So just play around, test render, see what your environment's looking like, and see how our light sources interact with the other lights, like the glowing eyes or the night sky that's glowing from the moon. It's time to animate the camera and render. We're gonna leave our camera where it's at right now, but let's Shift A and add an empty, and then copy the rotation and location of our camera and parent the camera to the empty that we just added in. So what we're doing here is it's going to provide a better smooth animation of our camera. So when you're animating the rotation of the camera, use the camera and add keyframes there. But when you want to animate the location of your camera, use the empty and add keyframes onto the empty. My render settings that I used are cycles. Make sure to use your GPU if it's available. I adjusted the render samples to 512. So I edited our light path a little bit. So for max bounce it equals 18, and then I adjusted the diffuse to 8, glossy to 8. I left the transmission at 12, or no, I adjusted the transmission to 14. And then I scroll down, add in a motion blur, and then in film, and then make your film transparent. And then in performance, change the tile size to 512 as well. And then for color management, I always like to use a medium high contrast. And then before rendering out, and to give ourselves a little more control over the compositing portion of this, I broke up our scene into 3 sections. I broke it up into foreground, midground, and sky. Create 3 new collection folders and label each one accordingly. So foreground, midground, and sky. And then for our foreground layer, I set the midground to holdout and indirect light. And then for the sky, I set it as indirect light. Create a new view layer and let's make this one our midground. And for the midground, I set the foreground to holdout and indirect light, and then the sky as indirect light as well. And then lastly, for our sky layer, I set the foreground and midground to both indirect light. And then before we render out, we can open up the compositor, click Use Nodes, and set your view layer to the foreground layer to render out to our foreground folder. And then in between the view layer and our file output, add in a denoise node and plug in the image normal and albedo. Duplicate all the nodes, but then replace the composite node with a file output node and set the path to the midground folder, and then repeat the same steps for our sky. And make sure to change your render layer to the matching file output. And now it's time to render. Godspeed and good luck to your computer. I hope it doesn't hate you after this. Once the scene is rendered out completely, we can open up a new Blender file and then select all, delete, and then open up our composite window and click Use Nodes. Immediately, let's add in a Viewer node and then delete the Render Layers node and replace it with a Image Sequence node. Load in the foreground folder, add in an alpha over, and then duplicate our image sequence and then load in our midground. And then our midground should be plugged into the top input and our foreground into the bottom. Add another alpha over and then bring in our sky folder. And the sky should be plugged into the top and our other alpha over plugged into the bottom. And then what I did to play around with the contrast and brighten up or darken certain portions of each layer is I put a RGB curves node in between the foreground and the alpha over and between the midground and alpha over. Now we can group all these nodes together and label it as the base scene. And then what I did was add in a overlay node and plugged in a vignette. I adjusted the overlay to 0.3. And then I added in another RGB curves node. And then in the factor, plug in another vignette, then an invert color, and adjust the curve accordingly. And then to wrap up our compositing, lastly, just add in a glare node, check fog glow, and then I adjusted the threshold to 0.5 and a size 9. And last, add in a lens distortion node. Check off the box that says fit, and then in dispersion I adjusted it to a 0.01. And then just create a final render folder and make sure we're going to be rendering out to that folder. And now, time to wrap up this scene and take a look. I hope you enjoyed making that spooky scene, and I hope you're just as happy as I am with it. You should be really proud of yourself because that environment actually had a lot to it, a lot of details and a lot of different aspects to it. I just want to thank you all for watching if you made it to the end. Thank you so much. I appreciate you so much. Be sure to like and subscribe down below. Comment what you want to see in the next tutorial or what you want to learn in Blender or what you want to see 3D printed. And until next time, stay creative and stay safe. Peace.